Hey everybody, it's Josh. Welcome to the Bees in the Weeds channel. I thought today I would do a video on how to get started in beekeeping for those of you that are thinking about venturing into the art and the science and the wonderful world of keeping bees. It's a question that I get asked fairly often from folks that are just thinking about, have been curious about bees in the past, and they come up to me and talk to me and they think that maybe that's something that they want to do. So I figured I'd give a real, sort of quick intro on everything that you need to think about before you decide to get into keeping bees. So the first thing I would say, a very important question to ask yourself is, why do you want to start keeping bees? And it's not that there's a wrong answer, but I think the why is going to help you find the means to an end. What is your end goal? Maybe you want to start producing your own honey. Maybe you want to start a little bit of a side hustle and have a honey business on the side, or be able to, offer products at your local farmers market, whatever the reason may be. Maybe you want to get into selling candles made from beeswax, or lip balms, or lotions. There's all sorts of products, cosmetics, as well as food that the wonderful honeybee provides for us that we can turn around and, produce and sell maybe at a farmer's market. So maybe that's the reason you want to get into it. Maybe you're very passionate about sustainability. Maybe you're very passionate about helping our food supply. Pollinators are extremely important in the agricultural landscape for helping our food supply. I've heard a statistic, and I don't have any way of verifying this, but I've read in several places that like 1 out of every 3 or 4 bites of food that a human takes is a result of a pollinator from the trickle-down effect. So I do know that pollinators are extremely important and vital to our ecosystem. So maybe that's one of the reasons you want to keep bees. Maybe you're just curious about these insects. Maybe you like farming, and that is what keeping bees is. You are farming insects. Maybe you like insects and you find bees fascinating. Maybe that's the reason you want to get into it. Whatever the reason is, just make sure you ask yourself that question so that you're getting into it for the right reason. This is not something that you just want to jump into on a spur of the moment decision, dive into keeping bees, because if you don't do your homework and your research on the front end, it could be a very unpleasant experience for you, when it could have been a very enjoyable, dare I say, therapeutic, nice, calming experience for you. So I think that's the first question that you really need to ask yourself. The second thing that you need to understand is that keeping bees is hard work. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat that. It's backbreaking, it's labor intensive, it requires a lot of your time, in my opinion, to do it correctly. There are very passive beekeepers. And I use that term beekeeper loosely in that case. So there are people that will just set up a hive somewhere on their property and let nature take its course. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't really think that's keeping bees. That's not really where you're farming bees or being a true beekeeper. So let's put that aspect aside. And this is for somebody that actually wants to get their hands in the bees, in person, outdoors. It's hard work. It's, a job that's 8 to 9 months long. It depends on where you are, obviously. So this is geographically dependent. Here in Kentucky, our off season is the winter months. So we're in December now. It's a lull time. A lot of times beekeepers during this time are working on their equipment. They're working indoors in a shop, refining things, building new things, repainting things, cleaning things of that nature, but they're not actually working with their bees. But come March timeframe, April timeframe, it's game on. And you're busy with your bees all the way to October into November, still doing maybe some mite treatments. So just understand that it's going to take a lot of your time. Now, however many hives you have, it's going to take more time. So starting out, I always recommend people start out with a minimum of 2 hives. And you say, Josh, why 2 hives? Why not just 1? And the reason is, when you're a new beekeeper, you don't know what you don't know. That's your biggest blind spot, right? Obviously. So by not knowing, if you have 2 hives, you can compare them. You can compare the entrance activity. You can compare when you're doing inspections. What does the health of the colony look like? What sort of activity am I observing? Am I seeing any signs of disease? Things of that nature. If you only have that 1 hive and you're a new beekeeper, brand new beekeeper, you probably don't know whether the hive's truly doing well or not, because you don't have anything to compare it against. So I would recommend at minimum starting with 2 hives. But of course, the more hives you have, the more work that's going to be involved. So be prepared before you decide to get into this, that you are able to dedicate and set aside enough free time to be able to properly take care of your bees, because you don't want to do a disservice to the honeybees if you decide to have bees on site on your property. You want to make sure that you're caring for them appropriately. The next thing that I would say is, keeping bees is expensive. At an absolute minimum, I would say first year, you can expect to spend roughly $1,000. And that's a ballpark. Now, don't get me wrong. There's ways to cut corners and get things cheaper. And maybe you have a beekeeper friend that's willing to give you a nucleus or a package or something along those lines. But if you're starting out with no, beneficial resources, and you're going online to buy, your first Langstroth hive, and you're going to buy a nucleus of bees, and you're going to get your bee suit and the equipment. We'll go over that here in a minute, all the PPE that is required when you're keeping bees. I would say make sure you have at least $1,000 for your first year. And it only goes up from there. Those of us that have been keeping bees for a little while now, the joke is always about, how much money we're spending on this hobby, right? Because it's not really a hobby. You are literally more of a farmer, and it's the world of keeping bees. And every time you turn around, there's something that requires you to spend money on, whether that be mite treatments, or maybe you're trying to grow your apiary in size. Apiary is a term for the bee yard where the bees are located. So anyway, bottom line, just expect that it's going to be somewhat expensive on the front end. After you get most of your equipment, your PPE, you get your apiary to the size that you want, approximately the number of hives that you want, you've got all your maybe honey processing equipment, then it's more of just a sustainable expense, an ongoing expense. But the upfront cost can be somewhat significant, so keep that in mind. What else? It is hot. And so bees are active during the spring. They kind of peak in the summertime and then sort of taper off in the fall. But during that late spring, summertime, when we have to get in our hives and you've got that full PPE on with your bee suit and your veil, it is hot. And if you live in a region, where I am, again, I'm speaking as since I'm in Kentucky, you can get summers in the 90 degrees, high 90 degrees, and you're in that bee suit. And, so if you struggle, I would say outdoors, working in the heat, I would take that into consideration. If you struggle working outdoors, lifting heavy objects, you're unable to physically manipulate equipment, I would take that into consideration. Beekeeping is very back intensive. And so you're spending a lot of time in that bee suit in the hot weather. Now, again, you stay well hydrated. You can use some beekeepers use fans around their neck. That helps. There's all sorts of ways that we try to stay cool. But for those of you that don't do well in the heat, I would take that into consideration if the climate in the region where you are has considerable hot summers or hot temperatures. So let's go over the equipment that at a minimum you're going to need to get started. So this is a Langstroth hive, and this was created and developed by Lorenzo Langstroth, I believe in 1851. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's right. And so he is the modern day hive beekeeper founder. And what that means is he created a man-made hive that allows for the removable frame. And I'll show you that here in a second. Well, what's so big about a removable frame? Well, it really sort of maximized honey, not honey production, but, well, the honey processing, the volume of honey that humans were able to get from hives. Because in the past, they used to just cut comb out of maybe a tree hollow where a natural wild feral colony was located. Having this with the ability to remove frames really made it a lot easier to disrupt the colony less and be able to extract the honey without necessarily harming or killing the hive in the process. So let's go over the components and the parts that are involved in a modern day Langstroth. So go ahead and take this off, and we'll start from the bottom. And as you can see, all of these come apart. So the first piece of equipment in a Langstroth is going to be your bottom board. Now, there's several different bottom boards out there. Bottom boards, there's solid bottom boards and there's screen bottom boards that you see here. I could do an entire video on the topic of bottom boards and the pros and cons versus each. It is a hotly debated topic in the beekeeping community, but that is not the purpose or the intent of this video. So I would say, choose a bottom board, and we'll get into a little bit later maybe what might go into your decision-making process. And one of the difficulties, and I would say one of the most challenges for a brand new beekeeper getting into beekeeping, I'll cover that in a minute. But the first piece of equipment in this Langstroth is your bottom board, and the screen bottom board is what I use. On top of that is called your deep. So this is a deep because, and I don't remember the exact dimensions, I don't have a tape measure with me, but there's deeps, there's mediums, and there's shallows. So this is the tallest box in a Langstroth setup, and we refer to it as deeps, and it sits right on top of the bottom board. Okay, now what is inside the deep? Well, that's where your frames are. So these are your removable frames. This is what Langstroth came up with, and so each one of these frames is covered with a piece of foundation. And there's different foundations. There's plastic foundations, there's wax foundations. You can do the research and the pros and cons of all of that. But again, this is what the bees will begin to build beeswax on. And that's what this is. This is beeswax. And so I'll bring you in a little bit closer on another one here where they've drawn out more of the wax. But that's what this is here. So you can see this is the honeycomb. And this one's one of my older hives, so it's not the cleanest. But that is what the bees have drawn out themselves, that they will begin to lay, the queen will lay eggs in there. They will raise young larvae, turns into bees. That's called brood, the brood area. They will store nectar. They will store pollen. They will store honey in this honeycomb. So there's 10 frames in this Langstroth. They make 8-frame Langstroths. But you can see this is a better frame that kind of shows you where the bees are starting to draw that out. And you can see where the foundation started and where this honeycomb that the bees have started to create. And it's truly amazing how they do that in a perfect hexagon shape. And so they do it on both sides of the frame. So that's your honeycomb. And the bees have wax-producing glands. We won't get into the super details. I'm trying to keep this pretty high level as a beginner intro video. But the bees can produce wax from their wax-producing glands. They manipulate it with their mandibles, and that's how they make this honeycomb. So this deep has 10 frames in it. And with beekeeping, bee spacing is extremely important. So all of this measurements and all of this space here is by design. 100% intentional. Because if you leave just one of these out, the bees will make a complete mess of this by building comb in here, and it won't make it easy to take that comb out. That's what's so brilliant about the Langstroth design, is the ability to manipulate frames and easily take them out. And so that is the deep. This is the area where the queen primarily does most of her laying. So this would be your brood area. And the queen can lay thousands of eggs a day. Each one of these frames, I believe, is 3,500 cells when full, approximately 3,500 cells each side. So 7,000 cells. And a good laying queen can fill up one of those in a day. So the deep area is primarily reserved for the brood rearing, and you'll generally see honey and food stores on the outer frames. Again, I don't want to get in the weeds on this. I want to keep it high level. So what goes on top of a deep? Well, sometimes another deep. So a lot of beekeepers will run what's called double deeps or even triple deeps, which can become massive colonies. So a single deep, which is what this is what I use in my apiary. I only run single deep, single brood management. It's also referred to as. What does that mean? It means I literally only have one deep on my hives. So what do you put after that? Well, I put honey supers on. Well, if it's not time for during a flow, which is what beekeepers refer to as the springtime, when all the flowers in the trees are blooming and nectar is abundant, we call that time period the flow. And the reason is because bees are flat getting on it. They are all over the place, gathering as much nectar as they possibly can, bringing it back to the hive and storing it so that they can have it through the winter time period when they're overwintering and they're clustered together. Well, what do we do as beekeepers? Well, we provide them places for them to store that honey, and that's what this is. So this is called a honey super. Why do we call it a super? I don't know. Maybe somebody can answer that for me in the comments. But as you can tell, it is shallower than a deep. Why? Why is it shallower than the deep? And why are the frames shallower? The reason is because of our backs. Because like I was saying, this is an extremely back-intensive, labor-intensive process. When these get full of honey, they can weigh 50, 60 pounds of honey in these. Picking those up can be very backbreaking over time. And a hive could end up having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these stacked on top of each other, depending on how good the flow is, how large the colony is, and how much honey is being brought, or nectar is being brought into the hive to be able to cure into honey. And again, you have to give bees space to cure the nectar and then turn it into honey. Again, I don't want to get into the details on that, so we'll keep this pretty high level. But this is a honey super, and so these honey supers, the same as the Langstroth, hold 10 honey super frames. And you can tell that the bees will start drawing wax on these just like they do in the deeps. So you can see where the comb is starting to be drawn out from this plastic foundation that's coated in wax, which encourages the bees to start drawing that out. But the queen is not going to, ideally, is not going to lay up here in the honey supers. This is for honey storage. So the bees will store nectar in here, and then they will convert that into honey, and then you'll be able to remove these when you go to extract and process your honey. Now, how do you keep the queen from getting up here and laying in the supers? The answer is you either do or you don't. Many beekeepers don't. Many beekeepers allow their queens to come up here and lay in the super, and then when that brood hatches into bees, the bees will backfill that area with honey, with nectar and honey. So it's not a big deal, because if it gives the bees more space, and again, there's all sorts of reasons to do this. It's a means of swarm prevention and swarming. We can get into that later, but that's the way the bees naturally divide themselves into two to ensure the proliferation of their species. So you're giving them more room. They don't feel like they're crowded. They'll stay here. But if you don't want your queen to lay up in the honey supers and you want her to stay down here, you can use something called a queen excluder. And that's what this is. And I use queen excluders. This is another very hotly debated topic in the beekeeping community. Lots of beekeepers swear by them. Lots of beekeepers call them honey excluders because they think it reduces the amount of honey that you'll get. Because once the bees establish a honey ceiling, the queen generally will not lay above that honey ceiling. But where is that ceiling in the colony? Again, she may come all the way up here if you have 3 or 4 supers up there. Personal preference, as is almost everything in beekeeping, is personal preference. So I will put this in between the deep and the honey super, and that is what a queen excluder. And what that does is it prevents the queen from being able to get up here. Well, how does it do that? Well, this bee spacing is very specific. It's very exact, and a queen has a much bigger abdomen than the worker bees. The worker bees can squeeze through here, a queen cannot. And that's how you keep the queen down in the deep. So, what goes on top of your honey supers? This is called an inner cover. And an inner cover is exactly what it's named. It is an inner cover. So, which keeps bee spacing in mind. So, this goes on top of the super or the deep. If you don't have supers on, you're not in the middle of a flow, or it's not during honey, when the bees are out foraging and bringing nectar in. So, or when you're in the middle of the wintertime, you're not going to have your honey supers on unless you're leaving them that for food over the wintertime, as you're quickly realizing There are so many different ways to keep bees. But I'm trying to keep it very generic. So take this honey super off. You can put it on the deep, or you can put this on top of your honey super. And what this does is allows the bees to crawl over the top of the frames. There's enough bee spacing here, enough of a gap, but doesn't give the bees just wide open space. Because if the bees are left with just wide open space, they will build a mess of comb. Why? Because they want to grow, they want to expand, the colony wants to get bigger. So this prevents them from doing that. But it doesn't fit completely flush with this. Otherwise, the bees will propolis, which propolis is essentially tree sap that foraging bees will go and gather, and they use it essentially to caulk a hive. Think of like caulking around your home, windows. They use it to seal. You know, they don't want ants to get in or any other type of insects that want to get to the delicious honey. Maybe it's for wind or for weathering purposes, just like you would use caulk around your house. That's essentially what bees use propolis for, and that's what this dark colored stuff is here on the edge. It's super sticky, has a lot of very beneficial properties. Google propolis, and you can learn all about it. Propolis, I believe, and fascinating stuff. But the bees will use that. And so because this is meant to be removable and easy for the beekeeper to pull this off and do an inspection, bee spacing has to be kept in mind with all of this stuff. Otherwise, the bees will just almost glue this down. So that's the inner cover. And then finally, the last piece is called the outer cover. And so this particular cover is a, what do they call it? A telescoping cover. So this telescoping cover goes over the top of the inner cover and hangs over the super, or again, the deep if this super was not on. And it just provides protection from the elements. Rain, snow, does help keep the heat inside the hive from escaping to an extent, and prevents wasps and other insects from being able to get in. And so the other type of cover that's common with the Langstroth is called a migratory cover. And that one just sits on top. Generally, you don't even have the inner cover, and it just sits on top here, and it will hang over the front, but it'll be flush on the side. And there's pros and cons to each, which again, I'm not going to get into right now. That's for another video. But this essentially is the modern day Langstroth hive. And the last piece I would mention is an entrance reducer. And so here's where the bees come and go. There's no other entrance into this hive except right here where the bees come and go. Now, somebody in the comments is going to say, what's that disc that you have on the front of the super? This is a Josh personal preference thing. I put these discs and drill a hole on the front of all of my supers because depending on the time of year and what's going on with the bees, I may want to give them another entrance to be able to quickly store nectar in here without traveling all the way through the deep and up through the queen excluder. I may want to put it queen excluder only, so, a queen couldn't return from her mating flight back in here. Ask me if that's happened. Or I may want to completely seal it up, or I may want to do ventilation only. So this disc gives me options, and that's why I have them on mine. One of those personal preference things I was talking about. So most colonies, the only way the bees come and go is through the bottom here. Well, this is an entrance reducer, and it does exactly what it says. It's reducing the entrance. So this is full open, obviously. Many bees could come and go. Well, why would you want to restrict that? Well, wasps and other pests or mice or all sorts of things could get in here if the colony is not of size and able to defend itself. So we use these as a means to help the bees be able to defend the colony and keep other unwanted pests or insects out. So this here is only about an inch opening, so the bees will use that. I personally, not one of those personal preference things, I leave these entrance reducers on all year long. Just like in the wild, if bees are coming and going inside a hollow of a tree and that tree only has this big of an opening, that's all the bees are using. That's my preference. Some beekeepers rotate these throughout the year depending on what's happening. If we're in the middle of a flow, they'll keep it wide open. As we head into the fall time period and nectar and food sources become rare, they'll close this off to prevent robbing. Well, what's robbing? Robbing is where another colony attacks a weaker colony and steals all their food sources in there. By reducing the entrances, even to maybe just a 3 or 4 inch entrance, you're allowing the bees the ability to defend themselves better. So that's what an entrance reducer is. So as a new beekeeper, if you purchase or if you order online a complete Langstroth set, this is what you can expect to get. Something very similar to this. This is the 10-frame Langstroth. They do make 8-frame Langstroth. What's the advantage, disadvantage? Well, it's lesser weight because it's smaller, but there's pros and cons to that. Could be a smaller colony because you have 2 less frames. It's less wide. So all sorts of reasons. It's all personal preference. The one thing that I would recommend as a new beekeeper, though, is pick a type or a size and stick with it. Because if you start to mismatch, you know, Langstroth hives versus European style hives versus polystyrene hives versus you're going to have that much more equipment on hand, and your costs are going to go up exponentially. So do yourself a favor, do some research ahead of the time, and then decide on a particular type of hive. You know, there's different brands out there, like Apime makes plastic type hives that are very nice. So do yourself a favor, do some research, pick a style and a type and stick with it, because then you will not have to keep as much inventory in terms of all these different sizes and different parts.